I'm Cassia Bellamy, 27. Until 3 months ago, I believed that hard work and good intentions were enough to protect you from people who want what you've built. Then my former best friend, Jolene, served me with legal papers claiming I stole her business idea, and everything I thought I knew about trust shattered like cheap glass. Her lawyer's letter still sits on my kitchen counter, coffee-stained and crumpled from the number of times I've read it. The words intellectual property theft and cease and desist blur together now, but I remember exactly how my hands shook when I first opened that envelope. What Jolene didn't know was that I had been working 18-hour days for 2 years to build this studio while she posted inspirational quotes on Instagram about manifesting success. But here's what makes this story truly unbelievable. How do you prove someone never contributed to something that only existed in late-night conversations over cheap wine? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The irony of it all was that 3 months before the lawsuit, I was living my best life. Not in the Instagram sense, I was too busy actually building something to document every moment, but in the quiet, satisfying way that comes from watching a dream slowly take shape in reality. My design studio, Bellamy Creative, operated out of a converted warehouse space in Portland's Southeast District. The kind of place where exposed brick meets modern lighting, where the coffee is always perfect, and the rent is just barely manageable. I'd spent 6 months hunting for that space, walking through dozens of sterile office buildings and cramped storefronts before I found the one that made me stop in my tracks. The morning light filtered through the tall windows in golden streams, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations. The previous tenant had left behind a few pieces, an old drafting table that I immediately claimed as my own, and a vintage leather chair that creaked pleasantly when I settled into it with my morning coffee. I'd furnished the rest gradually, piece by piece, as my client roster grew. A sleek white desk from a liquidation sale, 2 mismatched but charming chairs for client meetings, a small kitchen area where I'd installed a coffee maker that rivaled any. Portland CAF acute. The walls displayed my work branding packages for local startups, website designs for artists, logo concepts that had evolved from napkin sketches to polished presentations. Each piece represented late nights, creative breakthroughs, and the gradual building of something that was entirely mine. I photographed everything meticulously, not for social media, but for my own sense of accomplishment. When clients visited, they could see the breadth of my work, the attention to detail, the evolution of my style. My typical day started at 6:30 with coffee and emails. By 7, I was at the studio, reviewing project timelines and preparing for client calls. I'd learned to block my schedule, carefully creative work in the morning when my mind was sharpest, administrative tasks in the afternoon, and client communications strategically spaced to maintain momentum without constant interruption. The work itself was everything I'd hoped it would be when I was pulling all-nighters in art school. Brand development for a local bakery that wanted to capture the warmth of their grandmother's recipes. Website design for a therapist who specialized in helping people navigate career transitions. Logo creation for a nonprofit focused on urban gardening. Each project felt meaningful, like I was helping people tell their stories in ways that mattered. My team was small but mighty. Yara Donnelly had started as a part-time intern, answering emails and organizing project files, but she'd quickly become indispensable. At 26, she was sharp, funny, and had an intuitive understanding of social media that I lacked. She'd grown up online in ways I hadn't, and she could spot trends and opportunities that completely escaped me. More importantly, she genuinely cared about the business. She'd stay late to help with presentations, offer creative input that improved my work, and celebrate our wins with the same enthusiasm I felt. Theo Marching had become my go-to web developer. After we met at a networking event 6 months earlier, he was 31, quietly confident, and had the rare combination of technical expertise and creative sensibility that made our collaboration seamless. He'd freelanced for years after a bad experience with a startup co-founder, and he understood the challenges of building something from nothing. Our working relationship had evolved into a genuine friendship, and maybe something more. Though we'd been too focused on work to explore that possibility. My mother, Lydia, remained skeptical of my entrepreneurial path, but had stopped asking when I was going to get a real job. She'd raised me alone, working as a seamstress, and her practical nature had taught me to value financial stability. She worried about the uncertainty of self-employment, the feast or famine nature of creative work, but she'd begun to see that I was building something sustainable. Her occasional visits to the studio had become a source of quiet pride for both of us. The evening routine was just as important as the morning one. I'd close the studio by 7, giving myself clear boundaries between work and personal time. I'd walk home through the neighborhood, stopping at the market for dinner ingredients or the bookstore for something to read before bed. My apartment was small but carefully curated plants that thrived in the western light, art from local creators, furniture that prioritized comfort over trends. This was the life I'd built methodically, carefully, with intention and countless small sacrifices. I'd skipped vacations to reinvest in equipment. I'd worked weekends to meet deadlines. I'd said no to social events to focus on client work. Every decision had been calculated to build toward this moment when the business felt stable, growing, and entirely mine. The first big break had come 2 months before the lawsuit. Pacific Northwest Tourism, a regional marketing organization, had awarded me their rebranding contract after a competitive pitch process. It was the kind of client that could transform a small studio into a legitimate agency, the kind of project that would attract other high-caliber clients. The contract was worth more than I'd made in the previous 6 months combined, and it represented validation that my work could compete at a higher level. I'd spent weeks preparing for that pitch, researching their history, analyzing their competitors, developing concepts that captured the unique character of the region. The presentation had gone perfectly. They'd responded to my ideas with the kind of enthusiasm that every creative person dreams of seeing. When they called to offer me the contract, I had literally jumped up and down in my empty studio, then immediately called my mother to share the news. The work itself was challenging and rewarding in equal measure. They wanted a complete visual identity that would work across digital platforms, print materials, and environmental applications. I was developing color palettes inspired by Pacific Northwest landscapes, typography that felt both modern and timeless, imagery that captured the region's natural beauty without falling into cliches. It was the kind of project that would define my portfolio for years to come. But success, I was learning, comes with its own complications. The bigger clients meant higher expectations, tighter deadlines, and more pressure to deliver work that justified their investment. I'd hired a part-time graphic designer to help with production work, and I was considering expanding to a larger studio space. Growth felt exciting and terrifying in equal measure. I'd also started receiving more attention within Portland's creative community. Invitations to speak at design events, requests for portfolio reviews from students, mentions in local business, publications. It was flattering and overwhelming, and it forced me to articulate my creative philosophy in ways I never had to before. I was becoming not just a designer, but a voice within the industry, and that visibility brought both opportunities and responsibilities. I was still learning to navigate. The personal side of my life was finally catching up to the professional. Success. Theo and I had been spending more time together outside of work, grabbing dinner after long days, or exploring Portland's weekend markets. There was an easy compatibility between us, built on shared experiences and mutual respect. He understood the demands of creative work because he lived them too. He celebrated my wins without feeling threatened by them, and he offered support during challenging projects without trying to solve everything for me. My friendship with Yara had also deepened beyond our working relationship. We'd started having coffee on Saturday mornings, talking about everything from career goals to family dynamics to the books we were reading. She brought a perspective to my life that I'd been missing, someone close to my age who was navigating similar challenges. Someone who understood both the excitement and anxiety of building a career in a creative field. Even my relationship with my mother had evolved as my business stabilized. Her worry had transformed into pride, and she'd started referring clients to me, friends who needed help with small business branding or personal projects. She'd begun to see that my unconventional path was leading somewhere meaningful, and her support meant more to me than any client testimonial. This was the life I was living when Jolene's lawsuit arrived like a tornado, destroying everything I thought I knew about friendship, trust, and the people I'd chosen to care about. Looking back, I can see how naive I was to think that success would simply be celebrated by everyone who claimed to care about me. I hadn't yet learned that sometimes the people closest to you are the ones most threatened by your growth, most invested in keeping you small, most willing to destroy what you've built if they can't claim credit for it themselves. The morning before the lawsuit papers arrived, I'd been working on mood boards for the tourism project, surrounded by images of coastal sunsets and mountain peaks, completely absorbed in the creative process that had always been my sanctuary. I've been happy in the truest sense, not because everything was perfect, but because I was building something meaningful with my own hands, my own vision, my own relentless effort. That happiness, that sense of security and possibility was about to become a memory. But I didn't know it yet. For those last few hours of innocence, I was still a woman who believed that hard work and good intentions were sufficient armor against the world's cruelties. I was still someone who trusted that the people I loved and supported would celebrate my success rather than try to steal it. The irony is that if I'd known what was coming, I might have spent that morning differently. I might have taken longer to savor my coffee, to appreciate the sunlight streaming through the windows, to feel gratitude for the quiet satisfaction of work that aligned with my values. Instead, I was already focused on the next project, the next goal, the next level of success I wanted to achieve. I had no idea that everything I'd built was about to be tested in ways I'd never imagined, or that the woman I trusted most in the world was about to teach me lessons about betrayal that would reshape my understanding of strength, strategy, and the difference between being kind and being smart. The lawsuit papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, delivered by a courier who seemed almost apologetic as he handed me the thick envelope. I was in the middle of reviewing final concepts for the tourism project, my desk covered with printouts and color swatches, a half-empty coffee cup growing cold beside my laptop. The ordinary nature of the moment made what happened next feel even more surreal. I signed for the delivery without thinking much about it. I received contracts and project materials by courier regularly, enough that it didn't seem unusual. But when I opened the envelope and saw the legal letterhead, the formal language, the phrase intellectual property dispute in bold letters across the top, my entire world tilted sideways. The name at the bottom of the document was what made me sit down hard in my desk chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. Jolene Keene versus Cassia Bellamy. My former best friend, my ex-roommate, the woman who'd been my maid of honor at my cousin's wedding just 18 months earlier, was suing me for theft of intellectual property, breach of partnership agreement, and damages totaling $50,000. I read the document 3 times before the words began to make sense. And even then, the reality of what I was seeing felt impossible to process. According to Jolene's legal team, I had stolen a business concept that we had jointly developed during our time as roommates. She claimed that Bellamy Creative was built on ideas that rightfully belonged to both of us, that I had violated our verbal partnership agreement by launching the business without her, and that my success was essentially theft of her intellectual contributions. The most staggering part was how detailed her claims were. She had dates, times, specific conversations we'd allegedly had about business plans and partnership structures. She referenced late-night brainstorming sessions that I remembered as casual conversations about our individual career goals. She had screenshots of text messages where I'd mentioned design projects, presented as evidence that I was secretly developing our business behind her back. Reading through her version of events was like looking at my life through a funhouse. Near everything was recognizable but completely distorted. Yes, we'd talked about our career aspirations during the 2 years we'd shared an apartment. Yes, I'd mentioned wanting to start my own design studio someday. Yes, she'd occasionally offered suggestions or feedback when I showed her my freelance work. But the idea that these conversations constituted a business partnership, that her casual input entitled her to half of everything I'd built, was so far from reality that I actually laughed out loud when I first read it. The laugh quickly turned into something closer to hysteria as the implications began to sink in. This wasn't just a legal annoyance, it was a direct attack on my reputation, my client relationships, and my financial stability. Jolene's lawsuit included a demand for immediate cessation of all business activities under the Bellamy Creative name, essentially asking the court to shut down my studio while the case was being resolved. I called Yara immediately, my hands shaking. As I dialed her number, she was at her day job but picked up after the first ring, probably because I never called during business hours unless it was an emergency. Yara, I need you to come to the studio as soon as you can, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Something's happened. Are you okay? Did someone break in? No, nothing like that. I just ... I can't explain over the phone. Can you get away? She arrived within an hour, finding me pacing around the studio with the lawsuit papers clutched in my hand. I had tried to work on other projects to maintain some sense of normalcy, but my concentration was completely shattered. Every few minutes, I'd reread portions of the document, searching for some detail I'd missed, some explanation that would make this make sense. Yara took the papers from me and read through them silently, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to anger as she processed what she was seeing. This is insane, she said finally. She's claiming she invented your business? The business you were working on before you even met her? That's not true, I said. We met in college. Remember? But we weren't roommates until after graduation. Right, but you'd been doing freelance design work since sophomore year. I've seen your portfolio evolution. There are client projects from before you even knew her. This was true, and it was one of the many details that made Jolene's claims so obviously fabricated. I'd been building my design skills and client base for years before we'd moved in together. The idea for Bellamy Creative had evolved gradually from my freelance work, not from any conversations we'd had as roommates, but as Yara and I dissected the lawsuit, I began to see how skillfully Jolene had constructed her version of events. She wasn't claiming to have invented graphic design or the concept of running a creative business. Instead, she was focusing on specific elements, the studio name, the service offerings, the target market focus, and arguing that these had emerged from our joint discussions about the creative industry. She had twisted every conversation we'd had about my career goals into evidence of collaborative planning. She had reframed her casual suggestions and feedback as substantial creative contributions. Most cleverly, she had positioned my discretion about my business plans, my natural tendency to keep my work private until it was fully formed as evidence. That I was deliberately hiding our partnership from her, the emotional manipulation was as sophisticated as the legal strategy. Jolene had included personal details in her affidavit that were clearly designed to make me look ungrateful and dishonest. She wrote about helping me through difficult periods, offering emotional support during stressful client projects, even paying for groceries when my freelance income was inconsistent. All of this was true, and all of it was irrelevant to her. Legal claims, but it painted a picture of me as someone who had betrayed a generous friend. What made it worse was that some of her descriptions of our friendship were genuinely touching. She wrote about late-night conversations where we'd supported each other through career uncertainties, about celebrations when one of us landed a new project or opportunity, about the genuine affection and trust that had characterized our relationship. Reading those passages, I found myself missing the friend I thought she was. Even as I reeled from the friend she'd actually turned out to be. The timing of the lawsuit was particularly devastating. Not only was I in the middle of my biggest project to date, but I was also at a point where my business was gaining momentum and visibility within the Portland creative community. Jolene had waited until my success was public enough to be worth attacking, but not so established that I could easily weather the legal and financial storm she was creating. Spent the rest of that first day making phone calls and sending emails to understand my options. I reached out to Ben Prado, a lawyer who specialized in intellectual property disputes and had been recommended by another designer who'd faced similar challenges. I contacted my insurance agent to understand what legal coverage I might have. I called my accountant to discuss the financial implications of defending myself against the lawsuit. Each conversation reinforced how serious the situation was. Ben explained that even frivolous lawsuits could be expensive and time-consuming to defend against, especially when they involved intellectual property claims. My insurance covered some legal expenses, but not the full cost of a prolonged court battle. My accountant warned that the lawsuit could affect my ability to secure new clients, since businesses often avoided working with contractors who were involved in legal disputes by evening. I was emotionally and physically exhausted. The studio. That had felt like a sanctuary that morning now felt like a crime scene. Every piece of my work potentially subject to Jolene's claims. I found myself questioning decisions I'd made months or years earlier, wondering if casual conversations I'd forgotten might be twisted into evidence against me. Theo stopped by around 7, after Yara had filled in on what was happening. He brought takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant and listened without interruption as I explained the situation. His response was characteristically measured and practical, which was exactly what I needed. First, he said, this is clearly bullshit, and everyone who knows you will see that immediately. Second, you're going to fight this, and you're going to win. Third, you're not doing this alone. His certainty helped calm some of my panic, but it didn't address the deeper questions that were keeping me awake at night. How had I so completely misjudged someone I considered a close friend? What other relationships in my life were built on false foundations? How could I trust my own judgment about people if I'd been so wrong about Jolene? The lawsuit had arrived. During what should have been one of the happiest periods of my professional life, and the contrast between my recent success and this sudden crisis felt almost deliberately cruel. I'd worked for years to build something meaningful, something that reflected my values and skills and vision, and now I was being forced to defend not just my business, but my integrity, my character, and my right to the success I'd earned. That First night, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I made two decisions that would shape everything that came next. First, I was going to fight this lawsuit with everything I had, not just because I was innocent, but because backing down would essentially validate Jolene's version of events. Second, I was going to be strategic about how I fought back. I wasn't going to let anger or hurt feelings drive my decisions. I was going to be smarter, more prepared, and more determined than she was. I didn't know yet what that strategy would look like, or how much the legal battle would cost me financially and emotionally. I didn't know that fighting back would require me to become a different version of myself, harder, more calculating, less trusting, but ultimately stronger. All I knew was that I wasn't going to let someone else's jealousy and dishonesty destroy what I'd spent years building. The woman who fell asleep that night was still the same person who'd woken up that morning. Someone who believed in fairness, who valued collaboration, who preferred to see the best in people. But she was also someone whose faith in those principles had been shattered in a single day. Someone who was beginning to understand that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never wanted to fight. The first few weeks after the lawsuit arrived were a masterclass in how quickly your entire life can become unrecognizable. Every morning, I'd wake up for a few blissful seconds before remembering that my former best friend was trying to destroy my business. And then the familiar weight of dread would settle over me like a light blanket. Ben Prado's office became my second home. He was exactly what I needed, in a lawyer, sharp, experienced, and completely unimpressed by the emotional drama surrounding the case. When I first met with him, I'd brought every document I could think of that might be relevant. Tax returns, client contracts, bank statements, email correspondence, even old college assignments that showed my design work predating my friendship with Jolene. "This is a nuisance lawsuit," he said after reviewing Jolene's claims. "She's hoping you'll settle rather than fight because fighting is expensive and time-consuming. The good news is that her case is weak. The bad news is that weak cases can still be expensive to defend." He explained the process in terms that made my stomach churn. Even if I ultimately won, the legal fees could easily reach $20,000 or more. The case could drag on for months, during which time I'd be dealing with depositions, document requests, and the constant stress of pending litigation. Worse, the existence of the lawsuit itself could damage my reputation and my ability to attract new clients. "What are my options?" I asked. "Fight it, settle it, or try to make it go away through other means," Ben said. "Fighting gives you the best chance of complete vindication, but it's the most expensive option. Settling means paying her something to make this disappear, which might be cheaper in the short term, but validates her claims. The third option is more creative, but it requires you to be strategic about how you handle this outside the courtroom." The idea of paying Jolene anything felt like swallowing glass, but I had to consider the practical realities. My business was still small enough that a prolonged legal battle could seriously damage my financial stability. The Pacific Northwest tourism project was proceeding, but they'd already started asking careful questions about my legal situation. After Jolene's lawyer had sent them a formal notice about the dispute, I decided to start with the most thorough documentation possible. If I was going to fight this, I needed to be able to prove every aspect of my case with clear, indisputable evidence. Yara and I spent entire weekends going through my files, creating a timeline of my business development that predated any significant interaction with Jolene. The exercise was both vindicating and depressing. Vindicating because it made absolutely clear that Bellamy Creative had evolved from my individual work and vision, not from any collaborative effort with Jolene. Depressing because it forced me to revisit every stage of our friendship and see how differently we'd apparently experienced it. I Had emails from 2019 discussing my plans to start a design studio, sent to my mother and other friends months before. Jolene and I had even decided to become roommates. I had client invoices from my freelance work dating back to college, showing a clear progression of skills and reputation building. I had business plan drafts, logo concepts, and financial projections all created independently and saved with timestamps that definitively predated our cohabitation. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. More importantly, I had evidence of what Jolene had actually been doing during the period when she claimed we were developing our joint business concept. Her social media posts showed her focused on completely different career goals. She'd been pursuing acting opportunities, taking classes in theater and voice work, posting about auditions and headshots. Her own email and text communications, which Ben's discovery process would eventually uncover, showed no indication that she considered herself my business partner or had any serious interest in the design industry, but building my legal defense was only part of the challenge. The emotional toll of the lawsuit was affecting every aspect of my life. I found myself unable to focus on creative work, second-guessing every client interaction, and obsessing over Jolene's motivations in ways that felt increasingly unhealthy. The hardest part was the isolation. Most of our mutual friends seemed to be taking a neutral stance, which in practice meant avoiding both of us until the legal situation resolved itself. I understood their position. Nobody wants to get dragged into someone else's legal drama, but it left me feeling abandoned during the time when I most needed support. Doubt my mother's response was characteristically practical, but not particularly comforting. "Why didn't you get everything in writing?" she asked during one of our weekly phone calls. "I always told you to document everything when it comes to business." "Because we weren't business partners, Mom. We were friends who happened to live together. I didn't think I needed legal protection from casual conversations about career goals." "Well, now you know better," she said, which was true but not helpful. Theo became my lifeline during this period. He understood both the practical and emotional challenges I was facing, and he offered support without trying to take over or solve everything for me. He helped me maintain perspective when I was spiraling into worst-case scenario thinking, and he provided the technical expertise I needed to document my business activities thoroughly. "Look," he said one evening as we sat in my apartment surrounded by boxes of documents, "Jolene is counting on you being too overwhelmed to fight back effectively. She's betting that you'll make emotional decisions instead of strategic ones. Don't prove her right." This became my mantra: be strategic, not emotional. Every decision I made needed to be calculated based on what would best serve my long-term interests, not what would make me feel better in the moment. It was a fundamentally different way of thinking for someone who'd always prioritized relationships and emotional harmony, but it was the mindset I needed to survive what was happening. The strategic approach started with how I communicated about the lawsuit. Ben had advised me to say as little as possible publicly, but I realized that saying nothing was allowing Jolene to control the narrative. She'd been subtle about it, but she was definitely talking to people in our shared professional and social circles, positioning herself as the victim of my betrayal. I decided to craft a careful response that I could use consistently when people asked about the situation. It acknowledged the lawsuit without getting into details, expressed confidence in my position, and emphasized my commitment to continuing to serve my clients professionally. I practiced this response until I could deliver it calmly and confidently. Regardless of how I was feeling internally, the client management piece was particularly delicate. I couldn't hide the existence of the lawsuit. It was public record. And Jolene's lawyer had already contacted some of my clients directly, but I could control how I presented it. I scheduled individual conversations with my most important clients, including the tourism board, to explain the situation from my perspective. I'm being sued by a former roommate who's claiming ownership of my business, I told them. Her claims are baseless, and I'm confident they'll be dismissed. But I wanted you to hear about this from me directly rather than through the legal notices you may have received. Most clients were supportive, or at least neutral. The tourism board was more concerned, understandably, since they were investing significant money in a rebranding project and couldn't afford to get caught up in legal drama. We agreed that I would continue working on their project while the lawsuit was pending, but they reserved the right to terminate our contract if the legal situation affected my ability to deliver quality work on schedule. This conversation was a wake-up call about how much I had to lose. It wasn't just my current income at stake, it was my reputation, my future client relationships, and the professional standing I'd worked years to build. Jolene wasn't just attacking my business, she was attacking my entire career. The realization made me angry in a way I'd never experienced before. Not the hot, impulsive anger that burns itself out quickly, but a cold, calculating fury that sharpened my focus and clarified my priorities. I wasn't going to let someone else's jealousy and dishonesty destroy what I built. More than that, I was going to make sure that her attempt to hurt me backfired spectacularly. I started researching Jolene's background more thoroughly, not to gather ammunition for a counterattack, but to understand what I was really dealing with. What I discovered was both illuminating and disturbing. This wasn't the first time she'd been involved in legal disputes with former friends or colleagues. There was a pattern of behavior forming close relationships with people who were achieving success, positioning herself as a collaborator or supporter, then claiming credit or compensation when their efforts paid off. I found social media posts from years earlier where she'd made similar claims about other friends' achievements. She'd suggested that she'd been instrumental in someone's job promotion, that her advice had led to another person's successful relationship, that her connections had made possible a friend's career opportunity. At the time, these posts had seemed like typical social media oversharing, but now they looked like evidence of a systematic pattern of taking credit for other people's successes. More concerning, I discovered that she'd been researching intellectual property law and business partnership structures for months before filing her lawsuit. This wasn't an impulsive decision made in a moment of jealousy. It was a calculated attack that she'd been planning while still pretending to be my friend at the discovery process that Ben initiated revealed even more disturbing details. Jolene had been screenshotting our private conversations for over a year, creating what appeared to be an evidence file long before she'd given me any indication that she was unhappy about my business success. She'd been systematically documenting interactions that she could later reframe as evidence of our supposed partnership. Most shocking of all, she'd attempted to register a trademark for Bellamy Creative just 2 weeks before filing her lawsuit. The application claimed that she was the rightful owner of the business name and had been operating under it since our roommate period. It was such a blatant lie that I actually felt impressed by her audacity. Even as I was horrified by her dishonesty, these discoveries confirmed what I'd started to suspect. Jolene wasn't just a friend who'd misunderstood our relationship or felt left out of my success. She was someone who deliberately cultivated our friendship as a means to position herself to claim credit for my achievements. Our entire relationship, from her perspective, had apparently been a long-term investment. Understanding this changed everything about how I approached the situation. I wasn't dealing with a former friend who'd made some bad decisions. I was dealing with someone who'd been systematically manipulating and deceiving me for years. The emotional betrayal was devastating, but it also clarified my options. I didn't owe this person anything resembling friendship or consideration. I owed her a thorough, decisive defeat. The question was how to achieve that defeat in a way that protected my interests while also ensuring that she couldn't do this to anyone else. Simply winning the lawsuit wouldn't be enough. I needed to win in a way that exposed her behavior and made it clear that attempting to steal credit for other people's work came with consequences. That realization marked the end of my defensive period and the beginning of something much more strategic and calculated. I was still the same person who valued fairness and honesty, but I was also becoming someone who understood that sometimes protecting those values requires being willing to fight for them without mercy. By March, I'd stopped thinking about the lawsuit as something that was happening to me and started viewing it as a problem I was going to solve. The shift in mindset was subtle but crucial. Instead of reacting to Jolene's moves, I was going to start making moves of my own. The first step was expanding my legal strategy beyond simply defending against her claims. Ben and I developed a comprehensive approach that included not just winning the current lawsuit, but positioning me to pursue countersuit options for damages, legal fees, and harm to my business reputation. If Jolene wanted to fight, I was going to make sure she understood the full cost of that decision. The best defense is often a good offense, Ben explained during one of our strategy sessions. Right now, she's controlling the narrative and the timeline. We need to shift that dynamic. I authorized him to begin an aggressive discovery process that would require Jolene to produce all communications, financial records, and documentation related to her claims. If she was going to argue that we were business partners, she'd need to provide evidence of her contributions, investments, and involvement in the actual work of building the business. I was confident that this evidence didn't exist because the partnership had never existed, but forcing her to try to produce it would expose the weakness of her position. Meanwhile, I was developing a parallel strategy for protecting and rebuilding my business reputation. The lawsuit had created uncertainty among some clients and potential clients, but it had also generated sympathy and support from others who recognized the situation for what it was: a blatant attempt to steal credit for someone else's work. Ray proved invaluable in this effort. Her understanding of social media dynamics and her ability to identify key influencers and Portland's creative community helped me craft a response that built support without appearing defensive or desperate. We weren't going to attack Jolene directly, but we were going to make sure that my version of events reached the people who mattered. The approach was subtle but effective. Yara helped me document my business development process more thoroughly, creating content that showcased the evolution of my work from college projects through freelance clients to the establishment of Bellamy Creative. The timeline we created made it impossible to argue that the business had emerged from collaborative work with Jolene. Every significant milestone predated our roommate period or occurred when she was focused on completely different career goals. We also leveraged the support I was receiving from other women in business who'd faced similar challenges. Apparently, what Jolene was doing wasn't uncommon. There was an entire network of female entrepreneurs who dealt with former friends, colleagues, or roommates attempting to claim credit for their success. Their experiences provided both emotional support and practical guidance for navigating the situation. One woman, Sarah Chun, had faced an almost identical situation 3 years earlier when a former business school classmate had sued her for allegedly stealing a startup idea they discussed. During study sessions, Sarah had not only won her case decisively, but had used the experience to build a consulting practice, helping other entrepreneurs protect their intellectual property and document their business development processes. The thing about these cases, Sarah told me over coffee, is that they're rarely just about money or legal ownership. They're about someone who can't accept that they didn't contribute to your success. Someone who needs to believe that you couldn't have achieved what you achieved without them. Understanding that psychology helps you develop better strategies for fighting back. Her insight was crucial for understanding Jolene's motivations and predicting her likely moves. This wasn't really about intellectual property or business partnerships. It was about ego and identity. Jolene had invested so much of her self-concept in being my friend and supporter that my independent success felt like a personal rejection. The lawsuit was her way of forcing me to acknowledge her importance in my life and career. Understanding this helped me avoid the emotional traps that might have derailed my strategy. Jolene was going to try to make this personal, to relitigate our entire friendship and my character as a person. She was going to present herself as the loyal friend who'd been betrayed by someone she trusted and supported. The more I responded to these emotional attacks, the more I'd be playing into her preferred narrative. Instead, I focused relentlessly on the facts and the documentation. Every interaction I had related to the lawsuit was professional, measured, and focused on the specific legal and business issues at stake. I wasn't going to get drawn into arguments about who had been a better friend or who deserved more credit for maintaining our relationship. This approach proved crucial during the deposition process, which began in April. Jolene's lawyer was clearly hoping that I'd become emotional or defensive when questioned about our friendship and my business decisions. Instead, I answered every question factually and specifically, referring to documentation whenever possible and avoiding speculation or emotional responses. The deposition revealed how weak Jolene's actual case was. When pressed for specific examples of her contributions to the business, she couldn't provide concrete details. Her collaborative work consisted mainly of casual conversations and general suggestions that any supportive friend might offer. Her partnership agreement was entirely verbal and had never been documented because, as I was able to demonstrate, it had never actually existed, more damaging to her case. The deposition revealed inconsistencies in her timeline and her understanding of basic business concepts. She couldn't explain how a partnership could exist without any written agreement, financial contributions, or documented division of responsibilities. She couldn't provide evidence of any work she'd done to develop the business or any client she'd brought to the relationship. Most tellingly, she struggled to explain why she'd waited until my business was successful to raise concerns about her alleged ownership stake. If she'd truly believed we were partners, why hadn't she demanded recognition or compensation earlier? Why had she been pursuing acting opportunities instead of working on our supposed business venture? Her answers to these questions were vague and contradictory, making it clear that her lawsuit was opportunistic rather than based on legitimate grievances. Ben was confident that her case would be dismissed when it reached court, but he also warned me that the process could still take months and cost thousands of dollars in legal fees. "She's hoping you'll settle rather than continue fighting," he explained. "Even though she's going to lose, she knows that losing costs you money and time you'd rather spend on other things." This calculation might have worked with someone who was primarily motivated by financial concerns or who wanted to avoid conflict at any cost. But Jolene had misunderstood something fundamental about who I was and what this fight meant to me. This wasn't just about protecting my business. It was about establishing that attempting to steal credit for other people's work came with serious consequences. I authorized Ben to reject any settlement offers and to begin preparing countersuit claims for legal fees, business damages, and intentional interference with client relationships. If Jolene wanted to turn this into an expensive legal battle, I was going to make sure she bore the full cost of that decision. Meanwhile, I was using the time and energy I wasn't spending on emotional drama to strengthen my business and accelerate my professional growth. The Pacific Northwest Tourism Project was proceeding ahead of schedule, and the quality of the work was exceeding even my own expectations. The legal challenges had actually sharpened my focus and motivated me to produce my best work. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jolene's attempt to destroy my business was actually forcing me to become better at running it. I was documenting everything more thoroughly, communicating with clients more professionally, and building systems that would protect me from future challenges. Her attack was inadvertently making me stronger and more successful by May. I'd also begun exploring opportunities that would have seemed too ambitious just a few months earlier. The visibility from the tourism project was attracting attention from larger clients and more complex projects. I was being invited to speak at design conferences and to participate in industry panels. My reputation within the Portland creative community was actually stronger than it had been before the lawsuit, partly because people respected how I was handling the situation. The contrast between my growing success and Jolene's legal struggles was becoming more apparent to everyone who knew us both. While I was building something meaningful and sustainable, she was investing her time and money in a legal battle that everyone could see she was going to lose. Her own behavior was proving that she lacked the judgment, character, and professional focus necessary to build a successful business. This realization led to the strategic insight that would shape the final phase of my response to her lawsuit. I didn't need to destroy Jolene to win this fight. I just needed to succeed so thoroughly and publicly that her claims became obviously ridiculous. The best revenge wasn't going to be legal or financial. It was going to be professional success. That made it clear to everyone that I'd achieved what I'd achieved through my own talent, work, and vision. The plan that emerged from this insight was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of spending all my energy fighting Jolene's lawsuit, I was going to use it as motivation to achieve a level of success that would make her claims seem not just false, but absurd. I was going to win so decisively in the marketplace that the legal victory would become almost irrelevant, but executing this plan would require me to take risks and pursue opportunities that pushed me far beyond my comfort zone. It would mean betting everything on my ability to deliver results that matched my ambitions. And it would mean doing so while still dealing with the stress and distraction of ongoing litigation. The woman who'd opened that first legal document 3 months earlier wouldn't have been capable of this kind of strategic thinking or willing to take these kinds of risks. But that woman had been naive about the realities of success and the people who would try to claim credit for it. The woman I was becoming understood that sometimes the best defense is an overwhelming offense, and that the most satisfying victories are the ones that make your opponent's attacks look petty and desperate by comparison. The call came on a Friday evening in June, just as I was closing the studio after a particularly productive week. Theo's name appeared on my phone screen, and I almost didn't answer. We'd made plans to meet for dinner, and I assumed he was calling to confirm our reservation. "Cassia, you need to sit down," he said without preamble. "I found something." His tone made my stomach drop. We'd been friends long enough that I could distinguish between his various levels of concern, and this was the voice he used for genuinely serious situations. What kind of something? The kind that changes everything about Jolene's lawsuit? "Are you at the studio?" "Yes, but..." "Stay there." "I'm coming over and call Yara. She's going to want to hear this too." 30 minutes later, the three of us were gathered around my desk as Theo opened his laptop and began explaining what he discovered. As a freelance web developer, he had access to various professional databases and archives that allowed him to research potential clients and competitors. He'd been conducting what he called due diligence on Jolene, trying to understand her professional background and verify the claims she was making in her lawsuit. What he'd found was explosive. Remember how Jolene claimed she came up with the idea for your business during your roommate conversations? Theo began. Well, I found evidence that she'd made nearly identical claims against someone else 2 years before she even met you. He pulled up a series of documents, legal filings, social media posts, and newspaper articles from Seattle. In 2020, Jolene had sued a former friend named Marcus Rivera, claiming that she'd been instrumental in developing his successful food truck business and deserved partial ownership. The details were strikingly similar to her current lawsuit against me: alleged verbal partnership agreements, claims of collaborative development, demands for financial compensation. It gets worse, Yara said, scrolling through the social media evidence. Look at these posts from 2019. She'd found Instagram and Facebook posts where Jolene had described her relationship with Marcus in almost identical terms to how she'd later described our friendship. She'd written about late-night brainstorming sessions, about offering emotional and financial support during difficult periods, about feeling like a silent partner in his success. The language was so similar to her current claims that it was clearly a practiced narrative, rather than a genuine description of unique relationships. Most damning of all, Theo had uncovered the outcome of the Seattle lawsuit. Marcus had fought Jolene's claims and won decisively. The court had found that her allegations were without merit and had ordered her to pay his legal fees. The judgment included language suggesting that her claims bordered on harassment and that she'd attempted to extract money from someone else's legitimate business success. She did this before, I said, trying to process the implications. She literally tried the exact same scam on someone else. And she lost, Theo added. Badly. Which means she knew when she filed against you that her claims were baseless. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a difference of opinion about your friendship. It was a calculated attempt to repeat a strategy that had already failed. The discovery changed everything about my understanding of the situation and my strategy for responding to it. This wasn't about Jolene feeling left out of my success or misremembering our conversations about business goals. It was about someone who had developed a systematic approach to targeting successful people and attempting to extract money through frivolous legal claims. Ben's reaction when I shared the new information was immediate and decisive. This gives us everything we need for a comprehensive countersuit, he said. She's engaged in a pattern of vexatious litigation, which is illegal in Oregon. We can go after her for legal fees, business damages, and possibly punitive damages. More importantly, the evidence would likely result in her current lawsuit being dismissed quickly rather than dragging on for months. Judges don't look favorably on plaintiffs who have a history of making similar baseless claims against multiple defendants. How did you find all this? I asked Theo. Public records searches, mostly. Legal filings are usually accessible online, if you know where to look. The social media stuff required some deeper digging. I had to use archived versions of her profiles to find posts she'd since deleted. His explanation reminded me how valuable it was to have technically skilled allies who understood how to research people's digital histories. Jolene had apparently thought that deleting old social media posts would eliminate evidence of her previous behavior, but she'd underestimated how thoroughly online activity can be preserved and recovered. That the emotional impact of these discoveries was complex and intense. On one hand, I felt vindicated. The evidence proved conclusively that I'd been targeted by someone with a history of exactly this kind of behavior. On the other hand, I felt foolish for not recognizing the warning signs or researching Jolene's background more thoroughly before allowing her into my life. You couldn't have known, Yara said when I expressed the self-doubt. She was specifically targeting people who were generous and trusting. Your openness wasn't a weakness. It was what she was looking for. This perspective helped me reframe my experience in a way that felt empowering rather than victimizing. I hadn't been naive or careless. I'd been deliberately targeted by someone who specialized in exploiting people's trust and friendship. Understanding this made me feel less stupid about being deceived and more determined to ensure that she faced consequences. For her behavior, the strategic implications were enormous. Instead of simply defending against her claims, I could now go on the offensive with evidence that she was engaged in a pattern of fraudulent behavior. Instead of a he said, she said dispute about our friendship and business relationship, this was now a clear case of someone attempting to repeat a failed scam. Then immediately began preparing motions that would bring the evidence of Jolene's previous lawsuit to the court's attention. The legal term was pattern evidence, and it would be devastating to her credibility and her case. No judge would take seriously the claims of someone who had made nearly identical allegations against another person just a few years earlier, but I was also thinking beyond the legal victory. The evidence we'd uncovered could be used to protect other potential victims and to expose Jolene's behavior more broadly. If she'd targeted Marcus and me, there were likely other people she'd attempted to scam or was currently targeting. I decided to reach out to Marcus Rivera directly. Theo had found his contact information through his food truck business, and I thought he deserved to know that Jolene was at it again. His response was immediate and supportive. "I've been wondering when she'd resurface," he wrote in his email. Reply: "She tried to contact me again about 6 months ago, claiming she had new evidence that would prove her case. I told her to communicate only through lawyers and haven't heard from her since. But I always figured she'd find another target." Marcus agreed to provide testimony and documentation that would support my countersuit. He also shared additional details about Jolene's behavior that helped me understand her methods more completely. She apparently studied her targets carefully, cultivating friendships specifically with people who were on the verge of significant success. She was particularly drawn to creative professionals and entrepreneurs because their businesses often emerged from informal brainstorming and collaboration, making it easier to claim credit for ideas and contributions. "The thing that made me angrier than anything," Marcus told me during a phone conversation, "was how she turned our friendship into a business transaction retroactively. We had genuine conversations and shared experiences, but she was apparently taking notes the whole time, looking for ways to monetize our relationship later." This exactly captured what felt so violating about Jolene's behavior. It wasn't just that she was making false legal claims, it was that she corrupted the memory of our friendship by revealing that she'd been calculating and strategic throughout our entire relationship. But the discovery also crystallized my determination to make sure she faced real consequences this time. Marcus had won his case, but Jolene had apparently learned from that experience and refined her approach. Her lawsuit against me was more sophisticated, better documented, and designed to avoid some of the legal weaknesses that had defeated her previous attempt. If I simply won my case and moved on, she'd likely target someone else in a few years with an even more refined strategy. The pattern would continue until someone stopped it decisively. I decided that someone was going to be me. Working with Ben, I developed a comprehensive countersuit that went beyond simply recovering my legal fees. We were seeking punitive damages for vexatious litigation, compensation for harm to my business reputation, and a permanent injunction that would prevent her from making similar claims against me in the future. We were also going to ensure that the outcome was public and well documented, creating a legal precedent that would make it harder for her to target future victims. The plan also included a strategic communications component. Once the court case was resolved, I was going to make sure that Jolene's pattern of behavior became widely known within the professional communities where she was likely to operate, not through social media attacks or personal vendettas, but through educational content about protecting yourself from frivolous, intellectual property claims and recognizing the warning signs of people who attempt to claim credit for others. Success. The discovery of Jolene's previous lawsuit had transformed this from a defensive legal battle into an offensive campaign for accountability. I wasn't just going to win, I was going to win in a way that protected other people from experiencing what Marcus and I had gone through. But executing this plan would require me to maintain focus and discipline over several more months while the legal process played out. I couldn't let the satisfaction of having found the smoking gun distract me from continuing to build my business and strengthen my position. The ultimate victory wouldn't come from exposing Jolene's past behavior, it would come from succeeding so thoroughly that her claims seemed not just false, but ridiculous. The woman who'd started this fight 3 months earlier had been primarily concerned with defending herself and preserving what she built. The woman I was becoming was thinking about offense, accountability, and using her own success to protect other people from similar attacks. It was a fundamental shift in mindset that would shape not just how I finished this battle, but how I approached every challenge that came after it. July marked the beginning of what I privately called my scorched earth phase, though that term didn't really capture the careful, methodical nature of what I was actually doing. It was more like controlled demolition, every move calculated to achieve maximum impact while maintaining the moral high ground. Ben had filed our countersuit with all the evidence of Jolene's previous litigation, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Within 2 weeks, her lawyer had requested a meeting to discuss resolution options, which was legal speak for, my client is screwed and wants to cut her losses. But I wasn't interested in allowing her to simply walk away from this without consequences. She's going to offer to drop her lawsuit if you agree not to pursue the countersuit, Ben predicted. It's the standard exit strategy for people who realize they've overplayed their hand. And what do you recommend? Depends on your goals. If you just want this to go away, you could accept that deal and move on with your life. If you want to send a message and potentially recover damages, we keep pushing. I'd been thinking about this decision for weeks, weighing the practical benefits of a quick resolution against the longer-term implications of allowing Jolene to escape accountability. The practical side of me wanted to end the legal drama and focus entirely on growing my business. But the strategic side understood that accepting a simple dismissal would essentially validate her approach. She could walk away knowing that the worst consequence of attempting to steal credit for someone else's work was having to abandon the attempt on pod. We keep pushing, I decided, but we also accelerate the business development timeline. This was the crucial piece of my strategy that I hadn't fully articulated before. I was going to use the remaining months of the legal battle to achieve such dramatic business success that the resolution of the lawsuit would feel like an afterthought rather than the main event. By the time we reached final judgment, I wanted to be operating at a level where Jolene's claims seemed not just false, but absurdly small-minded. The Pacific Northwest Tourism Project had become my launching pad for this acceleration. The work I delivered exceeded their expectations so significantly that they'd already begun referring me to other organizations and expanding our original scope. Instead of simply developing their visual identity, I was now designing their entire digital presence, creating marketing materials for major campaigns, and consulting on their strategic positioning within the tourism industry. More importantly, the quality and scale of the work was attracting attention from much larger potential clients. I'd received inquiries from national brands, international nonprofits, and government agencies looking for design expertise. These weren't the kind of opportunities I'd been pursuing 6 months earlier. They required capabilities, resources, and confidence that I was only now developing. But pursuing these opportunities while managing ongoing Litigation required a level of focus and energy that pushed me beyond any previous limits. I was working 12-hour days, managing multiple complex projects simultaneously, and maintaining the documentation and preparation necessary for the legal battle. The pressure was intense, but it was also clarifying. I'd never been more certain about my capabilities or more motivated to prove them. Yara had become my unofficial chief of staff, managing client communications, project timelines, and the administrative work that I didn't have time to handle. Her role had evolved far beyond what either of us had originally envisioned, and I'd increased her compensation and responsibilities accordingly. She was now essentially my business partner in everything but legal title, and her contribution was becoming indispensable. "You know what's funny?" she said during one of our late-night work sessions. "Jolene's lawsuit is actually making your business stronger. You're documenting everything more thoroughly, communicating more professionally, and pushing yourself to achieve at a higher level. She's accidentally providing the pressure that's forcing you to become the entrepreneur you always had the potential to be." This observation crystallized something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. The legal challenges had stripped away my tendency toward perfectionism and overthinking, forcing me to make decisions quickly and execute them effectively. I didn't have the luxury of second-guessing myself or waiting for ideal conditions. I had to perform at a high level while dealing with significant stress and uncertainty. The skills I was developing went far beyond design and client management. I was learning to negotiate complex contracts, manage multiple revenue streams, build strategic partnerships, and maintain professional relationships under difficult circumstances. These were executive-level capabilities that typically took years to develop, but the pressure of fighting the lawsuit while growing the business was accelerating my learning curve dramatically. Theo had also become more deeply involved in my business operations, transitioning from occasional contractor to strategic advisor. His technical expertise was crucial for the larger projects I was pursuing, but his perspective on business development and risk management was equally valuable. He'd been through his own entrepreneurial challenges and understood the balance between aggressive growth and sustainable practices. "You're reaching the point where you need to make some fundamental decisions about what kind of business you want to build," he told me during one of our planning sessions. "The opportunities you're being offered are amazing, but they're also going to require you to scale up significantly. More staff, bigger office space, more sophisticated systems. Are you ready for that?" The question forced me to confront the reality that my success was creating its own challenges. 6 months earlier, I'd been focused on establishing a sustainable solo practice. Now I was being invited to compete for projects that would require me to build a legitimate agency with multiple employees and substantial overhead costs. The decision was complicated by the ongoing lawsuit, which created uncertainty about my financial situation and made it difficult to plan for major investments. But it was also motivated by the lawsuit. I wanted to achieve success so dramatic that it would make Jolene's claims seem ridiculous to anyone who had followed my story. I decided to take the leap. Working with a business advisor that Ben had recommended, I developed a plan for scaling Bellamy Creative from a solo practice to a small agency within 6 months. The plan included hiring 2 additional designers, expanding to a larger studio space, and pursuing the kind of high-value contracts that would establish us as a significant player in the Pacific Northwest design market. The risks were substantial. If the expansion failed, or if the legal costs exceeded my projections, I could find myself in serious financial trouble. But the potential rewards were equally significant, not just financially, but in terms of establishing myself as someone who had turned a malicious attack into an opportunity for dramatic growth. The expansion began in August with the signing of a lease for a new studio space in Portland's Pearl District. The location was prestigious, expensive, and perfectly suited for the kind of clients I was targeting. It was also a public statement about my confidence in the business and my commitment to growth despite the ongoing legal challenges. The hiring process was more complex than I'd anticipated. I needed designers who were talented enough to work on sophisticated projects, but also compatible with the culture I was trying to build. I was looking for people who shared my values around client service, creative excellence, and professional integrity, values that had been tested and refined through the experience of fighting Jolene's lawsuit. I found two exceptional candidates through Portland's design community. Elena Vasquez was a senior designer with agency experience who was looking for an opportunity to take on more strategic responsibilities. David Park was a recent graduate whose portfolio demonstrated both technical skill and creative vision. Both were excited about joining a growing studio and contributing to its development. The new hires meant that I could pursue multiple large projects simultaneously while maintaining the quality and attention to detail that had become our reputation. It also meant that I was no longer a solo practitioner who could be easily dismissed or marginalized, was building something substantial that demanded respect from competitors and potential clients alike. The symbolic impact was as important as the practical benefits. By expanding dramatically during the period when Jolene was trying to claim credit for my previous success, I was demonstrating that my capabilities extended far beyond anything she could have contributed to. The business I was building bore no resemblance to the casual conversations she'd cited in her lawsuit. It was a sophisticated operation that required skills, knowledge, and experience that she simply didn't possess. Then followed our response to Jolene's settlement overtures in September, making it clear that we weren't interested in a quiet resolution. We wanted a court judgment that would establish the facts clearly and create a public record of her behavior. We also wanted damages that would reflect the full cost of her frivolous lawsuit, including not just legal fees but the time and energy I'd spent defending against her baseless claims. Her lawyer's reaction confirmed that we had her cornered. They requested multiple extensions, attempted to negotiate partial settlements, and eventually began suggesting that Jolene might be willing to acknowledge that her claims had been overstated in exchange for a dismissal without penalties. She's desperate, Ben told me. She knows she's going to lose badly, and she's trying to minimize the damage. But the evidence is too strong and the pattern is too clear. She's going to face consequences this time. Meanwhile, the business expansion was exceeding even my optimistic projections. The new studio was attracting attention from clients who wouldn't have taken meetings with me when I was operating out of a smaller space. The additional staff allowed us to take on more ambitious projects and deliver them with higher quality and faster turnaround times. Our revenue was growing month over month, and our client satisfaction scores were consistently excellent. The contrast between my growing success and Jolene's legal problems was becoming increasingly apparent to everyone in our shared professional and social circles. While I was being featured in design publications and invited to speak at industry conferences, she was dealing with depositions, document requests, and mounting legal fees. By October, I realized that I'd achieved something I hadn't originally planned, but that felt deeply satisfying. I'd used her attack as motivation to reach a level of success that made her original claims seem not just false, but insignificant. Even if she had somehow been entitled to credit for my early business development, that contribution would now represent a tiny fraction of what Bellamy Creative had become. The final phase of my strategy was beginning to crystallize. I wasn't just going to win the lawsuit. I was going to win so thoroughly and succeed so dramatically that the resolution would become a case study in how to respond to malicious attacks with strategic excellence rather than emotional reaction. But executing This final phase would require me to maintain focus and momentum through what I knew would be the most intense period yet. The legal case was approaching trial, the business expansion was requiring constant attention, and the personal toll of fighting on both fronts was beginning to accumulate. The woman who'd opened that first legal document 8 months earlier couldn't have imagined the person I was becoming or the empire I was building. But she also couldn't have imagined the cost in time, energy, and emotional resources that transformation would require. As I prepared for the final confrontation, I had to decide whether the person I was becoming was worth the price I was paying. To get there, the courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly gray and uncomfortable plastic chairs that reminded me of high school. I'd imagined something more dramatic for what felt like the climactic moment of this entire ordeal, but the mundane settings somehow made everything feel more real and immediate. It was November 15th, and after 9 months of legal maneuvering, depositions, and strategic positioning, we were finally facing Jolene's lawyer across a courtroom. Ben had prepared me for the possibility that she might settle at the last minute. Apparently, many frivolous lawsuits ended with whimpering rather than banging, but her lawyer had insisted they were prepared to argue their case. I studied Jolene. As she sat at the defendant's table, trying to reconcile the woman I was seeing with the friend I'd once trusted. She looked older, more tired, and there was a nervous energy about her that I'd never noticed before. She was wearing a conservative navy suit that seemed designed to make her appear professional and credible, but it only emphasized how out of place she looked in this setting. The judge, Maria Santos, had a reputation for no-nonsense efficiency and little patience for frivolous litigation. Ben had researched her background thoroughly. She'd been a business lawyer before becoming a judge, and she had particular expertise in intellectual property disputes. Her experience would make it difficult for Jolene's lawyer to rely on emotional appeals or vague claims about partnership relationships. The proceedings began with opening statements that laid out the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the case. Jolene's lawyer, Robert Chun, attempted to portray this as a story about friendship betrayed, about a collaborative relationship that had been dissolved unfairly when success arrived. He emphasized Jolene's emotional and financial support during my early struggles, her contributions to brainstorming sessions, and her reasonable expectation that she would share in the benefits of our joint efforts. Ben's opening was surgical in its precision. He systematically dismantled each of Jolene's claims with documentation, timelines, and evidence that made her version of events seem not just false, but deliberately deceptive. He introduced the evidence of her previous lawsuit against Marcus Rivera, framing this case as part of a pattern of targeting successful people with baseless intellectual property claims. Your Honor, Ben concluded, this case is not about friendship or collaboration. It's about someone who has developed a systematic approach to claiming credit for other people's success, hoping that the cost and inconvenience of litigation will motivate her targets to pay her rather than fight. Ms. Bellamy's decision to fight these false claims has revealed not just the weakness of this particular case, but a pattern of behavior that represents a form of legal harassment. The testimony phase was where Jolene's case completely collapsed. Under cross-examination, she couldn't provide specific examples of her alleged contributions to the business. Her descriptions of our collaborative brainstorming sessions were vague and contradictory. When pressed for details about our supposed partnership agreement, she admitted that we'd never discussed profit sharing, decision-making authority, or any of the basic elements that would characterize a genuine business relationship. Most damaging was her response when Ben asked about her previous lawsuit against Marcus Rivera. She clearly hoped this evidence wouldn't be admissible, and when Judge Santos ruled that it was relevant to establishing a pattern of behavior, Jolene's entire demeanor changed. She became defensive, evasive, and increasingly desperate in her attempts to distinguish her current claims from her previous failed lawsuit. "Miss Keene," Ben asked, "isn't it true that you made nearly identical claims against Mr. Rivera, alleging that casual conversations about business goals constituted a partnership agreement?" "That was different," she replied. "Marcus and I had a more formal understanding." "But you've just testified that formal understandings don't require written documentation. How should this court distinguish between your claims against Mr. Rivera, which were found to be without merit, and your claims against Miss Bellamy?" She couldn't answer the question coherently, and her lawyer's objections only emphasized how problematic her position had become. My own testimony was straightforward and well prepared. I walked through the timeline of my business development, showing how each major milestone had predated any significant input from Jolene or had occurred when she was focused on completely different career goals. I provided documentation of my work, my client relationships, and my financial investments in the business. When Jolene's lawyer attempted to portray me as ungrateful and secretive about my business plans, I was ready with evidence of how open I'd actually been about my goals and progress. I had emails to my mother, conversations with other friends, and social media posts that showed I'd been transparent about my entrepreneurial aspirations and activities. "Ms. Bellamy," Robert Chen asked, "didn't you feel that Ms. Keene's emotional support and friendship during difficult periods entitled her to some recognition of her contribution to your success?" "I absolutely valued Jolene's friendship," I replied. "But friendship and emotional support, however meaningful, don't create ownership rights in someone else's business. If they did, every entrepreneur would owe their friends and family members equity stakes in their companies." The judge's reaction to this exchange suggested that she understood the fundamental issue at stake. Allowing emotional support and casual conversation to create legal ownership claims would make it impossible for anyone to discuss their career goals with friends without risking future litigation. The most powerful moment came when Ben introduced evidence of Jolene's social media activity during the period when she claimed we were developing our business together. Her posts from that time showed her completely focused on acting opportunities, auditions, and entertainment industry networking. There were no mentions of design work, business development, or any of the activities that would characterize someone who considered herself a business partner. "Ms. Keene," Ben asked, "if you truly believed you were co-developing a design business with Ms. Bellamy, why do your social media posts from that period show exclusive focus on acting and entertainment?" "I was pursuing multiple opportunities," she answered weakly. "Multiple opportunities that apparently didn't include any actual work on the business you now claim to own half of?" Her lawyer's objection was sustained, but the damage was done. It was clear to everyone in the courtroom that her claims about collaborative business development were fabricated after the fact. The evidence phase included testimony from Marcus Rivera, who appeared via video conference to describe his experience with Jolene's previous lawsuit. His account was devastating. She'd used almost identical language, made almost identical claims, and had shown the same pattern of turning casual friendship into retroactive business partnership claims. "What was most disturbing," Marcus testified, "was realizing that she'd apparently been taking notes during our conversations, looking for ways to claim credit for my work later. It made me question every interaction we'd had, wondering whether she'd seen our friendship as a business opportunity rather than a genuine relationship." Yara and Theo also testified about their observations of my business development process and Jolene's actual level of involvement. Their accounts confirmed that I'd been working independently, making my own decisions, and building the business through my own efforts and vision. By the time closing arguments arrived, the outcome felt inevitable. Jolene's lawyer made a final appeal for sympathy, arguing that friendship should mean something and that my success had been built partly on the foundation of support she provided. But Ben's closing was devastating in its systematic destruction of every element of her. Case. Your Honor, he said, this case represents exactly the kind of frivolous litigation that our legal system is designed to discourage. Ms. Keene has attempted to monetize a friendship retroactively, claiming ownership of someone else's work based on casual conversations and emotional support. If such claims were legally valid, every successful person would be vulnerable to demands from anyone who had ever offered encouragement or listened to their ideas. Judge Santos's ruling was swift and comprehensive. She dismissed all of Jolene's claims, finding them without merit and apparently fabricated to exploit the defendant's success. She granted our countersuit in full, ordering Jolene to pay all legal fees, damages for harm to my business reputation, and additional penalties for vexatious litigation. More importantly, she included language in her ruling that would make it much more difficult for Jolene to pursue similar lawsuits in the future. The judgment specifically noted the pattern of behavior revealed by her previous litigation and warned that future frivolous claims could result in more severe penalties. The moment when Judge Santos announced her decision was surreal after 9 months of stress, preparation, and strategic maneuvering. The resolution came in less than 5 minutes of judicial pronouncement. Jolene's face went completely white as the full scope of her defeat became clear, and her lawyer began whispering urgently about appeal options that we all knew would be futile. But the real satisfaction came not from her obvious distress, but from the realization that I'd achieved something much more significant than a legal victory. In the 9 months since her lawsuit had arrived, I transformed my business from a small solo practice into a growing agency with multiple employees, prestigious clients, and a reputation for excellence. I'd used her attack as motivation to reach levels of success that made her original claims seem not just false, but absurdly small. Minded. The woman who'd opened that first legal document had been primarily concerned with defending what she'd already built. The woman walking out of the courtroom had built something so much larger and more significant that the original dispute felt like ancient history. But more than that, I'd learned something crucial about the difference between being nice and being smart, between avoiding conflict and strategically managing it. I discovered that sometimes the best response to an attack isn't defense, but overwhelming offense. And that success itself can be the most devastating form of revenge. As we left the courthouse, Ben shook my hand and offered congratulations, but I was already thinking about the next phase. The legal victory was satisfying, but it was also just the beginning of what I wanted to accomplish. I'd proven that I could build something significant under pressure, that I could outmaneuver someone who was trying to destroy me, and that I could turn a malicious attack into an opportunity for dramatic growth. The question now was what to do with those capabilities and that momentum. I'd started this fight as someone who wanted to protect what she'd built. I was ending it as someone who discovered she could build almost anything she could envision, and who was ready to test the limits of that vision. 6 months after the court victory, I stood in our new conference room watching Elena present brand concepts to a client from Vancouver, and I had to remind myself that this was actually my life now. The space was 3 times larger than my original studio, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered views of the Willamette River and walls covered with work from projects I couldn't have imagined pursuing a year earlier. Bellamy Creative now employed 8 people, including 2 senior designers, a project manager, a business development specialist, and Yara, who'd become our creative director and my unofficial business partner. We were working with clients across the Pacific Northwest and had just signed our first international contract with a sustainable tourism organization in British Columbia. The legal settlement from Jolene had covered all our court costs and provided additional compensation that I'd reinvested entirely in business expansion. The irony wasn't lost on me that her attempt to steal from my success had ultimately funded my growth to a level where her original claims seemed laughably small, but the real transformation wasn't financial, it was psychological. Fighting her lawsuit had forced me to develop capabilities I'd never needed before. Strategic thinking under pressure, the ability to compartmentalize stress while maintaining high performance, and most importantly, the confidence to take risks that my previous self would have considered reckless. The business achievements were measurable and satisfying, but they were also just one dimension of what had changed. I'd become someone who documented everything, who researched people thoroughly before trusting them, who thought several moves ahead in every professional relationship. Some might call it paranoid. I preferred to think of it as educated caution earned through expensive experience. My relationship with Theo had evolved as naturally as everything else during this period. We'd been through enough high-pressure situations together that the transition from professional collaboration to personal partnership felt inevitable and comfortable. He'd moved his own freelance practice into our building, and we were exploring the possibility of more formal business collaboration. "You know what I find most interesting about all this?" he said one evening as we walked home from the studio. "You didn't just beat Jolene, you became someone she could never have beaten. The person you were a year ago might have been vulnerable to her tactics. The person you are now would have seen through her immediately." This is true in ways that went beyond business skills or legal knowledge. I developed what I could only call strategic empathy, the ability to understand people's motivations and predict their behavior without being manipulated by emotional appeals or false intimacy. It was a harder way of moving through the world, but it was also more honest and ultimately more effective. The most unexpected outcome was the consulting work that had emerged from my experience. Other entrepreneurs who faced similar challenges began reaching out for advice about protecting their intellectual property, documenting their business development, and dealing with frivolous legal claims. What had started as informal conversations evolved into a structured practice helping creative professionals defend themselves against various forms of exploitation. Sarah Chen, the woman who'd faced her own frivolous lawsuit years earlier, had become a mentor and collaborator in this work. Together, we developed workshops and resources for creative entrepreneurs about recognizing and preventing the kind of situation I'd endured. "The sad truth," Sarah told me during one of our planning sessions, "is that success makes you a target for people who feel entitled to claim credit for things they didn't do. The higher you rise, the more important it becomes to document everything and be selective about who you trust with detailed information about your work." This lesson had applications far beyond legal protection. I had become much more intentional about every aspect of my business relationships, from client onboarding to vendor selection to employee hiring. I wasn't cynical or suspicious, but I was thorough and strategic in ways that my younger self would have found exhausting. The personal growth was as significant as the professional development. I'd learned to value myself and my work in ways that weren't dependent on other people's validation or approval. Fighting Jolene's lawsuit had required me to articulate my own worth clearly and defend it aggressively, and that practice had changed how I approached every negotiation and business decision. My mother's response to my transformation was characteristically blunt and perceptive. "You've gotten harder," she observed during one of her visits to the new studio. "Not mean, but tougher. Less worried about whether people like you." She was right, and I considered it a positive change. The people-pleasing tendencies that had made me vulnerable to Jolene's manipulation had been replaced by a clearer focus on outcomes and results. I still valued relationships and collaboration, But I was no longer willing to sacrifice my own interests to avoid conflict or maintain false harmony. The legal victory had also provided closure in ways I hadn't anticipated. Ben had ensured that the judgment against Jolene was public record, creating a permanent documentation of her behavior that would be discoverable by anyone who researched her background in the future. It wasn't vindictive, it was protective, making it harder for her to target other people with similar tactics. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to Los Angeles, ostensibly to pursue acting opportunities, but more likely to escape the reputation damage from the lawsuit. I felt no satisfaction from her apparent struggles, but I also felt no guilt about the consequences she was facing. She'd made deliberate choices to target and harm other people, and accountability was appropriate. The most meaningful validation came from unexpected sources. Marcus Rivera had become a friend and occasional business partner, and his perspective on what we both endured helped me process the emotional dimensions of the experience. The thing that took me longest to get over, he told me during one of our conversations, wasn't the legal battle or the financial costs. It was realizing that someone I cared about had been calculating and strategic throughout our entire friendship. It made me question my judgment about people in ways that took years to rebuild. His experience provided a roadmap for my own emotional recovery. The betrayal had been real and significant, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about recognizing authentic relationships versus transactional ones. I was more selective about who I trusted with personal information, but I was also more confident about identifying people whose intentions aligned with their actions. The business continued growing beyond my most optimistic projections. We'd been featured in several design publications, and I'd been invited to speak at conferences about both creative entrepreneurship and legal protection for small businesses. The visibility was gratifying, but it was also strategic the higher my profile became. The more difficult it would be for anyone to make credible claims about having contributed to my success without documentation. Looking back, I could see how every stage of the ordeal had contributed to capabilities I was still discovering. The legal research had made me more thorough and analytical. The financial pressure had forced me to become more efficient and focused. The public attention had required me to develop better communication and presentation skills. Even the stress and uncertainty had strengthened my ability to perform under pressure and maintain perspective during difficult periods. The question that occupied me now was how to use these hard-won capabilities in ways that created value beyond my own business. Success. The consulting work was meaningful, but I was beginning to envision larger possibilities, perhaps writing about my experience, developing educational programs for entrepreneurs, or creating resources that could help people avoid the kind of exploitation I'd faced. But I was also learning to be patient with my own ambitions. The rapid growth of the business had taught me the importance of sustainable development rather than explosive expansion. I wanted to build something that would last and continue creating value, not just achieve dramatic short-term success. The evening routine I'd established during the lawsuit had evolved, but remained important for maintaining perspective and balance. I still walked home through the neighborhood, though now it was through Portland's Pearl District rather than my old residential area. I still stopped at bookstores and markets, though now I was accompanied by Theo more often than not. The rituals provided continuity and grounding even as everything else about my life transformed. As I reflected on the journey from that first devastating legal notice to the thriving business I was running now, the most striking realization was how much I'd underestimated my own capabilities. The woman who'd opened that envelope had been competent and hardworking, but she'd also been limited by assumptions about what was possible and what she deserved. The woman I'd become had learned that success requires not just talent and effort, but also the willingness to defend what you've built and the strategic thinking to turn attacks into opportunities. She discovered that sometimes the most important battles are the ones you never wanted to fight. And that victory isn't just about winning, but about who you become in the process of fighting. 6 months after the court victory, I was running A business I was proud of, surrounded by people I trusted, and equipped with capabilities that would serve me regardless of whatever challenges emerged next. Jolene's lawsuit had been intended to destroy what I'd built, but it had actually forced me to build something much larger and more resilient than I'd originally envisioned. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't destruction or retaliation. It was becoming so successful that your opponent's attacks seemed petty and irrelevant by comparison. It was building something so meaningful and substantial that attempts to diminish it only highlighted the attacker's own limitations and motivations. Standing in that conference room, watching my team present work to clients who respected our expertise and valued our contributions, I realized that I'd achieved something more satisfying than any legal victory could have provided. I'd proven to myself and everyone else that success built on authentic effort and genuine value is ultimately unassailable, regardless of who tries to claim credit for it or tear it down. The lawsuit papers that had once seemed so threatening were now filed away in a cabinet, relevant only as documentation of a challenge I'd overcome completely. The business they'd tried to destroy had become something neither Jolene nor I could have imagined when this all began, not just a successful design studio, but a platform for helping other people protect and defend their own creative work. Looking ahead, I could see opportunities and challenges that would have terrified the woman who'd started this journey, but that excited the woman I'd become. I'd learned that capability and confidence are muscles that strengthen under pressure, and that the most valuable lessons often come from situations you wouldn't choose but can't avoid. The story that had begun with betrayal and legal threats had become one of growth, resilience, and strategic transformation. It was a better ending than I could have written myself, and a stronger foundation than I could have built without the pressure that Jolene's attack had provided. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up making you stronger than you ever imagined possible. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the catalyst for the best thing you ever accomplish. Sometimes the most valuable lesson is learning that you're capable of much more than you thought, and that lesson is worth whatever it costs to learn it. 6 months after the judgment, people still ask me how it felt to win. They expected me to say it was triumphant, cathartic. That I'd popped champagne and danced around the new Bellamy creative headquarters like I was the heroine in a redemption movie. But here's the truth. Victory didn't feel like a climax. It felt like an exhale. A long, deliberate release of tension that had lived in my muscles and behind my eyes for nearly a year. It felt quiet, tired, like watching the sun rise after surviving a night you weren't sure you'd get through. Yes, I won. On every legal front. But what stayed with me wasn't the court transcript or the formal language of Judge Santos' ruling. What stayed with me was the way I stood straighter when I walked into client meetings. The way I didn't hesitate anymore before speaking with authority. The quiet shift in my posture that told everyone in the room, I earned this. And I won't apologize for it. Bellamy Creative had become something bigger than I ever intended. What started as a solo studio had evolved into a boutique agency with a reputation for bold creative work and unshakable business ethics. Our client list now included national nonprofits, climate tech firms, and one surreal but deeply rewarding project with an indie film studio. We were booked 6 months out, and I'd finally stopped waking up in the middle of the night panicked about cash flow. But it wasn't just the business that had changed. I had changed, not in the cynical, hardened way I'd feared during the lawsuit, but in the way a forest reshapes itself after a fire. Stronger, less flammable, more deliberate about what's allowed to grow back. YARA was now my official co-director. We stopped pretending that her role was anything less than foundational, and formalized her equity in the company with a contract that was more detailed than it probably needed to be, but that's who I was now. No more verbal agreements, no more we'll figure it out later. Theo's consulting practice was now fully embedded into Bellamy Creative's infrastructure. What began as freelance tech support and emotional scaffolding had evolved into a full strategic role. We worked better when we built together, personally too. But that was something we kept between us, uncomplicated, Unlabeled, fiercely respectful dot as for Jolene. There was no dramatic postscript, no apology letter. Number. Moment of contrition. She disappeared from the Portland scene completely. Last I heard, she'd resurfaced in Los Angeles under a slightly altered name, promoting herself as a creative advisor for intuitive entrepreneurs. I didn't waste time chasing justice that had already been delivered. Some people learn. Others reinvent, and I'd already spent enough time being haunted by someone else's projections. Now, I was building something future-facing, and I'd only just begun. There are stories we tell ourselves about how things will end. Neatly, decisively. A final court ruling, a slam door, a last look exchanged before walking away forever. But endings are rarely tidy. They leak into everything, even after the judgment was final. After the checks cleared and Jolene's name became a whisper in professional circles, I still found myself hesitating before trusting someone new. I still ran background checks on potential collaborators. I still flinched when a client asked, "So, how did you get started?" The irony? My story had never been more public. Articles had circulated about the case, how I'd won, what it revealed, what it meant for other entrepreneurs. A business podcast even asked to interview me about navigating betrayal while scaling under pressure. I declined. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I was still untangling what I'd lost in the process, because I did lose something. Not the business, not my reputation, but something quieter. A version of myself who used to believe that good faith was enough. That loyalty guaranteed safety. That if you supported someone, they'd never weaponize it against you. That Cassia was gone. In our place was someone sharper, wiser, still kind but no longer soft. Still collaborative but never naive. I'd learned to draw clearer boundaries. Yara and I sat down and wrote an internal document we called the Partnership Charter, not for legal reasons, but to ensure we were never operating under assumptions. Every role, every responsibility, every expectation, it was all laid out in language that would have once made me uncomfortable. Now it made me feel free. The paradox was that clarity created more room for trust, not less. When you know exactly where the edges are, you can move with more confidence inside them. Our team had grown, not just in numbers, but in culture. Every onboarding included sessions on IP protection, professional ethics, and clear communication. It wasn't overkill. It was the architecture that allowed us to build something stable. But despite all the new systems and layers of protection, I didn't become a fortress. I still cared, deeply, probably more than I should. I still left handwritten notes on employees' desks when they did exceptional work. I still sent clients thank you gifts that were tailored, not templated. I still walked around the office on Friday afternoons and asked everyone, "What was your win this week?" Because I didn't want survival to cost me my humanity. I just wanted the people who entered my orbit to understand something fundamental. This business, this success, it came with a spine. And I wasn't interested in pretending otherwise anymore. There's strength in kindness. But only when it's paired with discernment. That's what I'd earned, what I kept. What I'd learned to live by. The view from my new office isn't symbolic. It's just a view sunlight over the Willamette, streetcars humming below, the city moving at its own pace. But every morning when I unlock the door and walk into that space, it reminds me of something essential. This is mine. Not because I claimed it, but because I built it, because I kept showing up when it would have been easier to retreat. Because I learned to speak the language of contracts, calendars, counterclaims. Because I stood still when someone tried to make me disappear. And now, I stand taller. It's strange how easily people forget what almost didn't happen. The agency, the team, the momentum, it's all thriving. But it came inches from unraveling. If I panicked, if I caved, if I'd let someone else rewrite my story because the noise was louder than the truth, but I didn't. That doesn't make me brave. It just makes me someone who was forced to choose between folding and evolving, and I chose to evolve. I've started mentoring now. Not formally, not with any Instagram fanfare. But word gets around, especially in creative circles. A copywriter being gaslighted by a former co-founder. A photographer whose ex is claiming rights to her portfolio. A woman who came to me last week and asked, voice barely steady, how did you prove the business was yours? I tell them what no one told. Me. Document everything. Trust slowly. Be kind but precise. And if someone tries to reduce your years of sweat equity into a claim of we talked about it once, you fight back with every receipt, every boundary, every ounce of clarity you can summon, not out of spite, but because your work matters. Because you matter. Sometimes I think about the version of me from a year ago, the one who stood in our studio holding a legal envelope with her name and her best, friends printed in the most unthinkable arrangement. I want to reach back and say, this isn't the end. It's a test, and you'll pass. Not perfectly, not without scars, but with a deeper understanding of who you are and what you're capable of. I don't think about Jolene much anymore. She's a ghost now, a footnote. The bad chapter in a book that ultimately became about something else, because that's what my story is now, not a lawsuit, not a takedown, not revenge, but resilience, ownership, evolution. I walk through these halls now and see people smart, fierce, committed creatives doing meaningful work that's rooted in integrity. I see a culture of clarity and collaboration. I see the company I dreamed about in whispered wishes, now alive and earning its place in the world every single day. And most importantly, I see myself not the woman who almost lost everything, but the one who reclaimed everything with vision, with strategy, and with her name still on the door. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.